Hey guys, welcome back to Wonderwalkers. Today's video is going to be all about tips on photographing the Aurora Australis, aka the Southern Lights. Most people have obviously heard of the Northern Lights or the Aurora Borealis, but the Southern Hemisphere also has its own version called the Aurora Australis. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that today, as Dan and I have both photographed the Aurora Australis and the Aurora Borealis. So we've been very lucky to see the Northern and Southern Lights, and we wanted to talk a little bit more about the Southern Lights because I feel like sometimes they don't get enough love and they don't get enough attention. So I think there's a lot of people out there who wouldn't actually know how to photograph it or when to see it or where you can see it from. So
some people might not even know it exists.
Yeah, exactly. I think I wasn't even that aware that we could actually see it from certain parts of Australia before. So we thought it would be a really great opportunity today to talk a little bit more about that and to give you guys some tips on how we did it. Keep in mind that we are not experts on the subject. We are just photographers and we have seen these Southern Lights ourselves, and we want to share with you guys how we actually did that and how we photographed them.
We were fortunate enough to be in New Zealand in August last year, and that's when we saw the Aurora Australis. So we were in Queenstown. We were basically following it up, and we'd actually gone to New Zealand in the hope of seeing it. We went to New Zealand at a specific time of year so we could possibly see it. And we were fortunate enough to actually see it because it is quite rare to see it in
It's
many
elusive.
parts of the Southern Hemisphere. So we were very, very lucky.
So we think that there's a few things, if you're really wanting to see the Aurora Australis and you're planning on traveling somewhere where you can see it, we think there's a few things to take into consideration first before you travel so you can have the best chance of seeing them in the end. So our first tip today is actually to join Facebook groups and to download Aurora forecast apps. So there are quite a few forecast apps out there. I have an app called Aurora Alerts that's just downloaded from the Google Play Store on my Android phone. I found that was really handy when we were in New Zealand and we needed to see what the KP level was. So the KP index is actually going to indicate how strong an aurora could potentially be in the area that you may be able to view it. So I find that that's a really good thing to look for in your forecasts, and you don't have to be an expert to do this. You just need to know the basics. There are a lot of different figures and tables and graphs that you need to look at, I think, as an expert, but if you're just after the KP number, sometimes that can really help you out in distinguishing what might be a good night to go and view the aurora. We also joined some Facebook groups before we went over to New Zealand last August, so I'm going to put a couple of them down in the description box below actually, but they were immensely helpful for us because in the end I feel like we have to give them thanks for the fact that we actually did see the aurora, because there's so many professionals that are in that group or in those Facebook groups that can really help you out with reading the forecasts and will really alert you if there's any chance of seeing an aurora on specific nights, and that's going to really help you out immensely with trying to see the Aurora Australis, because it is a little bit more elusive. It's a little bit rarer than the Aurora Borealis too, so I definitely recommend joining some Facebook groups and getting those forecast apps.
Our second tip revolves around location. So being the Southern Lights, it is a bit more elusive, as Kaylee said, than the Northern Lights, but you have to be as south as possible. In Australia, places like Victoria and Tasmania. In New Zealand, the South Island, specifically places like Invercargill or Queenstown or Dunedin are really good, and even parts of very southern Argentina. Or if you go to Antarctica, you might be able to see them there as well. So you want to be in those latitudes that are further south. The further south you are, probably the more likely you are going to be able to see them.
So just like the Northern Hemisphere and the Northern Lights, a lot of the time you'll be viewing them in places like Sweden or Canada or Iceland, and they are in much higher latitudes. So you just need to kind of flip it for the Southern Hemisphere and get to those places. But specifically, like Dan said, Tasmania is a really good viewpoint for them, as far south as you can get. So around Hobart and further south is pretty good. And then for New Zealand, you'd be looking at Invercargill being probably the best place, or one of the best places to go and see them, along with Stewart Island, I think it is, in New Zealand as well. We actually saw them for just outside of Queenstown, like Dan said, but we did have to get to a place that was quite dark, and we're going to go into a few more tips surrounding how your environment should look when you actually do photograph the aurora in just a second.
Our next tip is the time of year. So this is really important in actually seeing the lights. So it's roughly from about April to September to be able to see them when the nights are longer, and so usually in the colder months is pretty much the best time to see them.
And the reason for this is because in winter you do have longer nights, you don't have daylight savings in the southern hemisphere, so you're basically increasing your chance of seeing them over a longer period of the night. The auroras can happen at any time of year, but generally if you're really wanting the best chance of seeing them, it's going to be between those months of April to September roughly. So as we just talked about before, there's only certain areas in the southern hemisphere where you'll really be able to see the aurora australis. And one other point that I should put along with that is going to be the KP index that I mentioned before. So the higher the number of the KP index, generally the higher the latitude will become where you can see the aurora from. So I know a couple of years ago there was a KP8 geomagnetic storm, I think they call it, and that actually reached as far north as Kiama in New South Wales in Australia. So that's how far north it can actually be seen from, but obviously that was more of a one-off. That was a really big storm from what I understand. And most of the time you'll be dealing with maybe KP5, KP6 if you're lucky, for a really good display. So usually it wouldn't go that far north, but just keeping that in mind, chances of you seeing it from different places in Australia or New Zealand in particular might depend on that KP number 2. So there are a couple of other things to take into consideration when you're really wanting to photograph the aurora or you're wanting to witness it with your own eyes, and that is going to be having a really good south-facing viewpoint.
Another really important aspect of it is having no full moon and clear skies. So when it's really cloudy, it can actually prevent you from seeing the aurora completely.
And this is why it's so difficult with the southern lights, because the weather sometimes is not so great down south, so you will have that cloud cover that you have to deal with, and then obviously you need to time it right so there's no full moon, because that can make it a little bit more difficult to see and to photograph. And obviously being in the right place at the right time in terms of latitudes and where you're actually viewing from.
Another important thing is to get away from cities where light pollution is a thing. So if you're in a major capital, the light from the actual city can prevent you from seeing it. So if you go further away from the city, the darker the sky is, the more likely you are to be able to see them.
And because the aurora australis tends to be at lower KP numbers for these types of latitudes, you'll tend to find that the aurora is not as visible to the eye. So you'll be able to see it, but it won't be as vibrant maybe as the northern lights at certain times, depending on the KP number, obviously, but a lot of the time it might be a little bit softer on the eye. So it's definitely important to remember when taking your photos to maybe have a decent camera, maybe not a smartphone. Smartphones these days can take some pretty good photos, and they have been known to take pretty good photos of auroras, but generally considering the southern lights can be a little bit on the weaker side at times, it's good to have like a very decent camera that you can have manual settings on.
So talking about cameras, an important thing is to have a tripod, something steady so your camera doesn't move. Another thing is you probably need to use a high ISO. You'll also need to have a slow shutter speed and a wide aperture.
And if you have the option to as well to set your lens to infinity, that'll give you the best way of being able to focus on the aurora.
So on the night that we saw the Southern Lights, we were basically keeping an eye on the updates on the Facebook groups and the Aurora apps. And we were looking at them pretty much daily for about 2 weeks before we actually saw them. And then this night in particular, the KP, I think it was about 5 or 6, and people in the Aurora Australis groups on Facebook were saying like, this is a really good night. It's dark enough to be able to see, and the KP number was high enough that you might be able to see it. And it wasn't a guarantee, but we basically kept looking at it all day. And then it got to like 6 or 7 o'clock, and everyone was saying basically, it's going to happen, go out. And so we drove probably about half an hour, 35 minutes out of Queenstown to a high point looking south. It was a very dark night. There was no lights around. And we actually managed to get some photos of the aurora.
So we're going to insert some of those photos into this video. You might have already seen a couple. I don't know where we're going to place them just yet. But we really were lucky on this night. There wasn't really going to be a guarantee that we would see them. However, we took the chance. We were all in our pajamas and we just like got in the car and drove. I remember being really... sorry to Dan, and also my mum and her friend were with us as well at the time. I was like, sorry guys, but this could be the time to go out and see them. And luckily we did, because it was the only night. We were in New Zealand for just over 2 months. It was the only night we actually saw them. So it was very lucky that we did it then. That's how rare they are. Across 2 months, we only had that one chance to go and see them. So if you can book a trip to these types of areas where you can see the Aurora Australis, kind of give yourself a bit of leeway. Give yourself a few weeks if you really want to see them, because, and there's no guarantee even in those weeks that you may, but it'll give you hopefully a little bit more of a chance.
So the first photos we took, we were on a high point looking south, and then we were heading back to Queenstown, and we sort of took another stop just next to the airport, and we actually got a few more photos right in front of the airport. So that was pretty cool. It did come over a bit cloudy at that point, and the aurora was a bit lower. So at that point it wasn't as vivid, but we still got some really cool photos, and pretty happy that we went out that night because, yeah, like Kaylee said, it was the only night in the entire 2-month trip that we actually saw them. We were hoping to see them. We were kind of not expecting to ever see them, but we were glad that we did, and we got some really cool photos.
So guys, we hope this video really helps you out if you're looking at going to find or to search for the Aurora Australis at some point in the next few years. If travel starts to become a thing again, we really hope it is going to with coronavirus, but we hope that these tips will be really helpful for you, and we hope you enjoyed this video.
If you want to see more photography related videos and tips and things like this, please let us know in the comments. This is something we think that we should do more of. We're actually photographers, we enjoy it, and I think we can tie this into Wonder Walkers really well because I think we're pretty good travel photographers.
Yeah.
And we would love to share our tips with you, and hopefully you enjoy them as well.
Thanks again for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next video.